Halito, which is Choctaw for welcome. I guess since we're on Kalapuya territory, I should say Gamchilahuan, so I will, even though my Kalapuya accent isn't all that great. Welcome to DiversiTV. I'm your host, Mark Harris. DiversiTV is a weekly interview show broadcast live from Lane Community College main campus. We talk about issues around the general rubric of diversity, though we try and go into it as far and in depth as we can. If you're new to DiversiTV, welcome. If you are part of our growing legion of fans, reveling in the saturation coverage that we get during spring break and other times, welcome back. DiversiTV's mission, and we choose to accept it, is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. Now, we're in season 10, and each season roughly corresponds to an LCC term, so we've almost been doing this for about 4 years. And this year we're looking at systems, and tonight's guest will be looking at part of that system. But just to give a little taste of where we're coming from today, let's see, where is the other file? Here we go. Oops, wrong one. We're going to be looking at and interviewing Judith Castro, or Judith if you prefer the English pronunciation. Transiciones is a program that's offered through the women's program here for Latina women, and welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
I ask a standard question, even though I know you're an American. Where are you from if you didn't come from here?
Well, my family roots are, my mother is from Cuba and my father is from Peru, and they're both immigrants, so I'm first generation born here. And I was born and raised in Connecticut, in Stamford, Connecticut, and from 0 to 18 years. So I have a really complex history. My mother is a Cuban refugee, and my father came here on a scholarship to community college, in Norwalk Community College.
Okay.
Yes.
Scholarship to study what?
I think it was general education at the time, but then he ended up studying computers when they were up and coming. So I think he started off with English classes and basic education.
Okay. How did you come to Eugene?
Well, that's a little bit of a long story, but...
That's okay. We've got an hour.
I was living in South Florida. I went to school in South Florida and started researching new places to live that were a little bit more progressive, perhaps, than where I was living.
Then South Florida?
Then South Florida. That's a whole ball of wax that we can talk about. Yeah. And I researched a bunch of places, namely that had universities where I could finish a PhD program. And there were only a few with feminist programs. And so we narrowed it down to several cities, visited Eugene, Portland, Seattle, Arizona, Boston, and Maine. And Eugene seemed like the best fit for us. So because of, mostly I liked...
Which us?
My husband and I.
Okay. Huh.
Yeah, and so he was thinking about returning to school as well.
Okay.
And we didn't want to be split between two different cities and have to commute because we don't like to drive, so, and we don't like to pollute. So we chose Eugene. I liked Eugene particularly because it was small and it reminded me of Stamford, Connecticut a lot, back in the 70s mostly. Right now it looks a lot different. Yeah. So a lot busier.
Yeah, right.
So it just felt like the right place, and I had also had a dream about Eugene before coming here, so that sort of validated coming here as being the right place. And we immediately made a bunch of connections with friends and people we didn't know, and it was pretty profound. So
seemed welcoming?
Seems, on a very spiritual level, very welcoming. Okay. So it's been mostly a good place to be.
So you came out looking for feminist programs. You found that at the U of O and here?
Well, at the U of O, it was interesting because as a graduate student in Florida. I was studying women's studies on my master's level and race, class, and gender issues. And so I went to a conference, a feminist philosophy conference. One of my other friends was a feminist philosopher. She was studying in Syracuse, but she had moved from Florida to study in Syracuse. And she said, you should come because there's going to be a...
I know.
Apparently, right?
Yeah.
I had no idea until she moved there. And so she said, come to this conference. You're in Florida, and it's on the west coast of Florida. So I went, and there was a bunch of U of O students from the feminist philosophy program. And unfortunately, when I moved, I had made contacts, and they said, don't come to the program. It's really changed a lot, and we're in the process of advocating because we're losing the structure of a really progressive program. So they said, you know, a lot of us threatened to drop out this term, and I ended up not attending because I didn't want to struggle in a PhD. So I waited till recently to decide to go back to school again and find the right program for me. So I wanted to be in a program that would be very supportive, and apparently the Master's in Couples and Family Therapy is. The faculty looks excellent. So.
And that kind of dovetails with your work here.
It does. So currently I'm the Transiciones teacher and student advisor, and I've been doing this program for 2.5 years in this community, and I absolutely love it. We serve Latina women who are anywhere in their educational process, so they could have very little education coming from wherever they're coming from, or they could be born and raised here, and or they could have, you know, be returning for another degree or a change in their career. They could be anywhere in their process of learning English, be fluent, or just starting off. And I love the program because it really meets the women where they're at. And we have scholarships for women who have financially need, are unemployed currently. Mostly we reserve it for that purpose at this stage. The program is very inexpensive. Currently it's $24 for 2 courses. And
which courses are those?
Transiciones and Teniendo Éxito en la Universidad. And that means Women in Transition in Spanish and College Success in Spanish.
Okay.
So we have those two classes available. And then when they're done with the classes, the idea is for them to continue seeing me in academic advising until they're ready to transition into English courses. And then I help them get acquainted with other student advisors on campus, sometimes while I'm still advising, because they may have questions that are beyond my scope of practice. So they might need more specific help on certain majors where they would need to have real clear answers for what classes to take, and so I often help them in that transition phase as well. So it's a great program because I think it's very supportive of the women. I help them to, and my assistant Rosa, Anaya, she's been with us for 1.5 years now, and she's a student, and she's also helping out with the program. So between the both of us, we try and really call women and make appointments with them and keep up with them as much as we can. We can't always call everyone to schedule, but they know they're also supposed to call in and keep their student advising sessions current and their career plans current. So that's another thing that I do with them, is do career planning, short-term and long-term, so that if they're just starting off with English, that they have like, okay, this vision of what is this going to look like? How long am I going to have to take English courses? And then once they're done with their English courses, okay, what's the next step? So we have like a little bit of a vision. And for some people, we've even gone as planning far as a master's degree, even though they're kind of midway in the English. I want the women to really think big, not just say, okay, I'm going to do this short little career, which is fine. Some people really, that's all they come and want, and that's perfectly fine. But some people have a real secret dream of really, they said, well, I used to dream about being an engineer, and I have 3 students that want to be engineers, and you would never have thought unless you really started talking with them and digging up those secret little dreams that they have about continuing on to higher education, and letting them know that that's a real possibility with quite a few careers that require masters and doctorates, and that they're really capable of doing it.
Well, and since you're on that path too, and you're, all right, well, you're first generation in this country.
Yes.
Right? But a first or second generation college student?
Well, my father did community college.
Okay.
And I don't know if he has an associate's degree, actually. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mostly look at myself as first generation because when my father entered, and whatever he has, he might just have a certificate. He's not really clear on it, and that's why I don't know. So given that, I didn't know how to apply for the SATs or the FAFSA, federal student aid. I didn't know really much about scholarships. I remember going to the counseling office, but they didn't really think I was very worthy of advising beyond suggesting very limited careers.
So here's, because we're looking at systems,
yes,
right?
This is fantastic.
And it's we're both employees of the college, but this wouldn't be DiversiTV unless I illuminated this.
Yes.
Right? So we often talk about, college opens doors, we're an open door institution, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we talk about what barriers there are, and you've illuminated 3.
At least.
3, at least, just in your personal history. So let me tick them off, okay?
Go for it.
All right, so if someone doesn't talk about their college attainment, that means they didn't get a degree, generally, right? Otherwise, they would talk about it, right? So you would be first generation.
Yes.
That's one barrier. FAFSA, all the forms, financial aid, is daunting even if you have a command of English.
Definitely.
And if you, but you were born here, so you were born bilingual, even though actually, if your experience is a common American experience, probably public school suppressed your being bilingual.
Yes, definitely.
All right, so probably would be like family members that would say, no, you were, while you were in my house, you were going to speak Spanish. Right? Was that part of your experience?
That was, but my mother gave in pretty easily because she was pretty much an easygoing person overall. Yeah. So I didn't speak Spanish from kindergarten through, thank God for my stepmother, 13 years old, or not my stepmother, my godmother. Yeah. She, I was allowed to go with her to Miami at one point, and she said, okay, if you want even one glass of water, you have to ask me in Spanish, and you won't eat unless you ask me in Spanish. And she was quite literal about it. She was always home, like 24 hours a day. I couldn't get a glass of water without asking please and thank you, and for the cup and exactly how I wanted it. And she got me speaking Spanish within a month, 1 month. I mean, it was there. My mother kept speaking to me. And occasionally I'd say a word to her, but I think I also did it out of spite because I was angry about a lot of things. So in part, the school systems and kindergarten, I remember very clearly the teacher saying, you cannot speak Spanish here in the classroom, because there was a few other little kids who were Latinos, and we would speak to each other because we kind of knew. And she changed my name to Judy, so that was interesting. I remember those things. I remember a lot about kindergarten. Okay. But the population has changed in Stamford, Connecticut a lot. And so that's exciting as well. And
somewhat in Eugene. Okay, so 2 barriers, right? So 1, the generation that you are in terms of college, being, parents with college graduates. If they're not, that's a barrier, generally, because there's class assumptions with college. Like, the default is middle class.
Yes,
and so if you're not middle class, then, and you don't have that reading level, all right, so there's the forms in, the federal forms in English and the reading level you have to be to even fill them out, right? Less of a barrier now, perhaps, but it's still there, it's still daunting. Partially your gender, because again, this was the history of this institution. Even though now at Lane the top folks are largely women, it was a male institution college was, you know, and especially when you add race and culture to that mix, you know, the expectations of Latina women, you know, your stepmom,
my godmother.
Godmother, okay, yeah, was able to stay at home, right? But, you know, was that going to be your expectation?
Yeah, that gets complicated.
And then those dreams, right? You know, dreams to reality.
Yeah.
You know, you know, okay, so we have a Latina woman sitting on the Supreme Court.
Yes, that's
Latina lawyer.
That's very inspiring.
Yeah, okay, so, right, being an engineer, being a doctor, you know, and you're on the process of being Dr. Castro. I like the ring of that, actually, you know.
This is a master's program, I'll clarify, just to be honest.
All
but
right.
I have the hope that I'll be able to continue.
Yeah.
So, and it's important for me because I want to be a role model for women. And honestly, it's a very interesting process being the Transiciones student advisor and teacher, because a lot of people might think, oh, you have a lot of confidence, or they see your name and they see your experience. But what people don't know when they see the resume and they hire me, and all those things that go behind it, is that really I've been terrified this whole time. Like, am I really like able to do this? Even though deep down inside I know the answer is yes. The truth is that it's terrifying because I feel really alone. Like there aren't how many women of color teach in this college? I mean, there's one or two maybe, faculty level, and I don't have that personal example in my life as someone close to me. My mother is a woman who has a 4th grade literacy in Spanish and a literacy level of a 1st grader in English. Okay. She still is that way. That is who I'm close to. My mother is on welfare. So like people don't understand the family dynamic and the background, and that's why.
And you were born here. So for your clients and students, right, who have that much more of a barrier if their experience is way different coming from somewhere else.
And in a lot of ways they're in a bigger disadvantage, and in some ways they have some advantage. And that's the thing, it's always like this multi-leveled thing. Like some people have an awesome family history. If they go back, they decide to go back because they want to change again, or they need to for whatever reason. Then sometimes people have a home to go through. They have, you know, big property. They have a whole family network. You know, that might be an advantage that they have over me. But in some ways, they might be here in a special circumstance beyond their really deep desire. Most of the women who are here because they had to come here out of necessity, out of economic necessity, because of the way the global economy is set up. And so they really didn't want to come here. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. They're here to pursue the American dream, but not because they necessarily just wanted to pursue the American dream, because there was a real necessity to do that, to provide for their family members. Some women have had to leave children behind. Some people are almost starving and on the street. Some people, you know, there's just, some people were professionals. So all kinds of women come to the program, and
they were professional in their countries of origin, and they're not here. Yeah.
And it depends on the career, but for the most part, that is true. And it depends on the country they're coming from, and our relationship, our political relationship with them, and our economic relationship with them. It's very complicated. It's not just a straight away, you know, you have this degree and it's automatically honored. It's what country, what degree, what school, all these differences. Was it a public school? Was it a private school? You know, in your country of origin. And
so in some cases, like we were talking about it the other day, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like a college degree in Mexico in some places could be more advanced than the equivalent number of time in America.
Yes.
So you could actually be more qualified in Mexico than you are in here, but not be considered as qualified as if you were European.
Exactly. And even at the high school level, this is something interesting I learned. I learned this past year that, and I learned this from Downtown Languages in a presentation. And what they let us know, and I've checked this out and it's true, is that the high school equivalency, which is called la preparatoria in Mexico and in Central America, that's what they call it, is higher than our high school education. So if you get a GED here and you decide to return home, you have a middle school education.
Wait, did I hear that correctly? An American GED is middle school in...
Or a high school diploma, or a GED in the United States.
In the United States is middle school in Mexico.
And in Central America.
In Central America.
Yes. And I would say that that's generally true for most of Latin America. Now, I don't know all the equivalencies because there's so many countries and they're all different. But I can tell you that when I was in Cuba as a high schooler, I was about, I was 16 and I was doing trig for the first time, trigonometry. My cousin, who was 12, was doing trigonometry.
A 12-year-old doing trigonometry in Cuba.
And she was not gifted, by the way.
Oh, and not a tag student. So let's try that on for size, Eugene.
And they don't have computer labs or a bunch of fancy stuff.
Right. Well, and that's actually a common experience. I've had a student, you know, from Africa.
Yes.
Who, okay, well, let's see. A TI-83 calculator is a year's salary. So no, we don't have one. So we have to do calculus in our head.
Yeah.
Memorize the formulas. And so when he comes here, and English is his fifth language.
Yeah, the fifth language in Africa, exactly.
His fifth language.
Easily.
Then, right.
Easily.
So he, you know, and he comes to Eugene, he comes to Lane Community College because the language program is, you know, internationally known, et cetera, et cetera. So.
And that's the thing. I mean, again, going back, you know, what I love is just to validate women where they're at. And if they don't have a higher education...
Because they're not necessarily getting validated here. Sorry for...
No.
I mean, that's a barrier.
That's the point.
Yeah, yeah.
And most people come after they've been here for a couple of years and they feel so browbeaten. And we want to be, and the Women's Center wants to be, a very welcoming place for these women to come to and to say, and the Multicultural Center as well, and say, okay, you're welcome to come here, and we actually validate your experience. We understand that you were a professional, or we understand that you lived in a small village and didn't have access to education, or maybe not even fresh direct water or something. So women are coming from all levels and just helping them to understand the nature of their circumstance and what has happened to them since they've come, as well as helping them to understand what happened to them when they were in their country of origin, if they immigrated, as well as supporting bicultural students who were born here or maybe came halfway in their life, and they have a totally different experience. And so helping to validate their experience, helping them to understand their experience. Transiciones does a lot of emotional processing and support, culturally appropriate support around these experiences, so that that way the women can understand what happened and the nature of oppression between sexism, racism, and class issues, and then, you know, say, okay, this stuff isn't my fault. Now what am I going to do with it? What are my real dreams? And so when the women start to, you know, dust off that dust that was thrown on them at some point in their history, then they can go forward. And I appreciate my experience at this stage in my life, because I feel like as a teacher I can relate to a lot of the different experiences that they've had on a real level, and they feel that that is true, and so we have a really good connection, and it becomes a very exciting program.
In terms of instilling that dream, as a mother, how do you do that? Because a lot of those, you know, you mentioned the women have families, so you're a pioneer, you know, and so in your case, Artemisia, right? But, you know, then how do you translate that experience to the women that have children that are the first one to go through college? And what, I mean, because that could be also, culturally speaking, you know, a motivator, you know, after you've been browbeaten. Why am I going through this browbeating? You know, these people putting me down because, you know.
I think it's kind of, again, complex to explain some of the layers. So as a mother, it can be a big motivator, and it could also be a big disincentive culturally. Depending on how traditional the women's roles are, what class they're at, what a class has a lot to do with it, as well as just what family expectations you have historically.
Now, we had this discussion earlier. What is class? What do you mean by class?
So by class, I'm talking about, so what, and the amount of money you have is one aspect of class. So if you have less money or more money or a lot of money, so lower class, middle class, upper class, and sort of the gray scale in between. Who possesses the money in the family? Because even if your family is technically middle class, there could be domestic violence, and someone could have, it's called intra-household disparity. They could have not really access to that money.
She's on a $10 a week allowance or something like that.
Yes, or just gets the grocery money.
Or just,
So that's also can happen. And any culture, just to clarify, because I don't want to sit here and say that sexism is worse in Latino culture. And so class issues and sexism and racism overlap and they intersect. And I can talk a little bit more about that.
The intersectionality piece, yeah.
But class is also like your level of education and how you're perceived and what groups you're accepted into based on that perception. Sometimes you can pretend you're of a different class and get into another class even though you're not. So there's just, class is a very complicated thing, but it basically has a lot to do with perception of money and how you feel about yourself in relation to your ability to move because you have more or less money in the world. And sexism is, of course, discrimination based on gender, and in our world, on our planet, it happens to be that men tend to hold special privileges for themselves, and women are deprived of access to those privileges. And similarly with race, it's based on your appearance and or cultural or language relations. So I was talking with someone today, white woman from here, right, who talked about in Brazil or other places, but Brazil was a specific example. Money whitens, but it only whitens so far. So far, because I want to give an example about Brazil. I have a little example. And in Brazil, for instance, I have a friend that is very, she's a friend from high school. This happened to her when she was in high school. And she always dressed very elegantly. Her mother had been a model in the 70s, and so they had these really high standards of dress. Her mother was an airline stewardess at the time, and so they got to fly around. Yes, it was that caliber of airline stewardess. And her mother is Haitian, and my friend is now living in France, and she's Haitian and African. And she always carried herself with grace. She was in Brazil, and what happens? She's in a hotel with her mother. They're enjoying their time there, and she steps out of the room and goes downstairs, and she keeps getting people offering her money. And she doesn't understand why at first, because she doesn't speak Portuguese. She speaks French and Creole and English, but not Portuguese. And then finally someone told her they think you're a prostitute. And so while I have Brazilian friends and I love to talk with them, and some will agree or see it, the racism or not. It's kind of like Cuba in a lot of ways. It is more progressive in certain ways, but it's definitely very discriminatory. I mean, my friend was just so offended. She didn't even want to leave the hotel room anymore. She was just so sick of it. So there is this, it only does wash you so far. And that's the thing that people, I want people to understand. I mean, no matter how much money you have, racism is still real. I mean, it's partially economically based. There's economic roots to it, but racism is still ultimately based on who you are and your background, and maybe language as well, ethnic perception, and it's a complex thing.
Right. The beginning of this country, the revolution was fought against a country that had a black woman sitting on the throne, who, even though she spoke 7 languages and had, Bach's and Mozart's composing music to her and flowers named after, it was still an issue that she was a mulatto woman. And, disparagement was made about her race, even though highly intelligent, capable of running the country, did run the country. So, I mean, the beginning of this country, race, you're Queen of England and they still diss you, or you're President of the United States and they definitely diss you.
Yes.
Even though you have high marks at Harvard and can speak well, and
all these things.
All those things, right?
And that's the thing. I mean, and part of Transiciones is preparing women for those realities, because I don't, and for them to understand that their position, depending on how they look like, because that is, for me, it's easier than for one of my friends who perhaps has more indigenous features that are prominent, or for a woman who's an Afrocentric Latina. And so I want the women to understand that and take that in a deep way and be supportive of one another, so that we can start changing this community and supporting one another. Because what I see and what happens with a lot of immigrants, not just women, but immigrants in general, and people of color also, is that we are left to fight for the crumbs, so to speak.
Yes.
And so we
instead of owning the bakery.
Yes.
If we're going to use that. Yeah. Oh, we get a slice of the American pie, but we don't own the bakery.
When we really do own the bakery, if we could just see it and then get that, you know, forget about the crumbs, let's get together and take the bakery and let's all share it together, you know. And
that's socialism.
Well, so
no, I thought it was free trade capitalism, actually, but owning the bakery. Why can't...
Genuine free trade without military intervention.
Ah, right, right.
So we talk about these things, about how to support one another and how to build community between the women. And that is one of the most important pieces. And I think Women in Transition also does that pretty well. The teachers there also try to bring up the issue of race, although it's less centered culturally, because it's more of a broad, you know, for the dominant population and English population. But they do some pieces on diversity. And I know that they're wanting to update materials as time goes on, and that's exciting as well. So,
can we switch to the computer signal for a second? Thanks. All right. So this is a Word file of your brochure.
Thank you.
And so I wanted people to see. Oh, it's great. Looks great on the screen. Living color. All right. So, woman lower left, lower right, holding the book, studious. Then we also have on the screen left a woman with clear African features as flagger. We're in construction because we have all those programs. So at least the face of the brochure is diverse and talks about because there are race and class issues within so-called Latin America. I mean, I've always found it ironic or fortunate either way that there are more black people, so to speak, if we're going to use that racial rubric, in Latin America than there are in America. And people don't necessarily get that, okay, we have an immigration policy because, stereotypically with, when we have Latinos or Latinas, immigration always comes up. Well, it's not just with them, but there is a racial bifurcation there, even in Cuba.
Yes.
Right? Black Cubans or Cubans that can't pass the paper bag test are treated differently than Blanco Cubans. So maybe people don't necessarily know that.
I don't think people are aware of that. And the whole reputation of the Mariel boat lift.
Right.
The 1980s immigration had such a terrible reputation, and they said it was all people from jail and mental health institutions, when in reality, yes, that was some part of the population. However, it was a lot more of the darker-skinned Cubans leaving of the lower, because there is a class structure in Cuba as well that was from the past, and there's still some of that lingering currently, although they've done a better job to eliminate some of that.
Better than Batista, for sure.
Oh, better than Batista, for sure. But the first wave of Cubans were the whiter-skinned, wealthier Cubans, and then the middle class, and then the lower middle class, and then so on and so forth, and then more of the darker skinned Cubans, and that was in the 80s. So that is, it's a racist stereotype in the way the papers portrayed it.
Well, even in the whole Elian Gonzalez affair, had a tinge of that too. In that four of the survivors, at least one of the survivors that made it over, was, as they say, and only because his girlfriend, who was Blanca, was able to get him a job, immediately did he stay. Otherwise, he would have been treated as a Haitian.
Yes, and that's the problem, I mean, and so many Haitians who are needing even more, you know, because Cuba has a great social system and they have medicine and free education for everyone. They do have levels of poverty with the food production because they are essentially living in times where the oil is not sufficient, and we're starting to see that here as well.
Yeah. Even cutting deals with Venezuela.
Exactly.
I mean, so just to illuminate that, you know, because we don't necessarily hear about that.
Yes.
So Cuba exports doctors.
Yes.
Okay?
They
and when, you know, Cuban doctors were some of the first doctors on the scene with the Haitian earthquake.
Yes.
But in addition, when you mention Venezuela, okay, Cuban doctors are being exported to work in rural Venezuela in trade for oil from Venezuela.
Yes. And Cuban doctors have been sent for decades. It was one of the purposes of the revolution. Well, they had two major focuses when the revolution started, and that was literacy for everyone. And they have, I think, a slightly higher literacy rate than we do. I think they're like at 98.9, something like that, higher than the United States. And their literacy level of actual ability to read at a higher level is higher than us.
Well, we would see that even with Mexico. So,
Yeah.
right, with Cuba or in other places, yeah, that makes sense.
And the second thing was medicine. So they wanted to train teachers and doctors. And so they did that, and their other purpose was to train women in those professions. And so they, Cuba has a higher percentage of women doctors. I think it's like 65%. And they've been exporting doctors, kind of like Doctors Without Borders, but even more so. They were sent to Africa, you know, extensively. Cuba supported the South African Revolution significantly. Nelson Mandela came out and shook Fidel's hand for helping so much. So it's interesting. I mean, Cuba and doctors are everywhere. Actually, Cuba will train an American citizen in exchange. I think I mentioned this on the last
I was
show.
trying to get that deal myself.
Yeah, and you know what? You really could if you probably advocated for yourself a little bit. They have a technical cutoff line at around 30, but I have known that they will accept students that appear to be serious and who speak Spanish and who are committed to their communities, because Cuba asks, the only thing that they ask in trade is that you return to your original community and serve an impoverished community within that community. So they want you to return to the United States, if you're a United States citizen, and serve here for at least, I think it's 2 or 3 years.
So, yeah, I think it's 3 years. And, right, they will accept anywhere in the third world, including Black America.
Yes.
That was a deal cut with the Congressional Black Caucus, though. That was under Bush 2, late Clinton. I don't know what the bombster has done with that, or if he's going to do anything with that. But
well, Bush was trying to phase it out. I haven't been updated with what Obama's doing with it. So the Cuban students from here, there's actually some people from Eugene studying, and I don't know their names, but they are there. It's exciting. It's very exciting. And we have a lot of good models for education. And I think Cuba's just one of them. And I think the Transiciones program is another one.
So, how do you appear, I guess, in this question of barriers, because by making them visible, I think that's one time-honored technique that we do in terms of, okay, yeah, you have to have a dream, you have to have drive, you have to have persistence, and I guess in athletics, to use that kind of meme, all right, you have to train for the hurdles before you get there.
Yes.
Right? And so, you know, if you have these immutable characteristics like your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation, which is one we haven't really talked about, which is a subset of gender.
Yes, definitely.
Gender roles. Okay, so Cuba's training women doctors, and I'm assuming they're not just training OBGYNs or neurosurgeons, and it's, you know, whatever it is you want to do, endocrinology, whatever it is. But, you know, there are hidden barriers in terms of what gender is. Can you talk about gender? What is gender?
So, gender, again, is another construct that we have. It's based on a perceived, because you are labeled, male or female because of your genitalia that you're born with, sometimes intersex. People don't know a lot about that, but quite a few people are born intersexed, so having 2 genitals. And so, but it's basically society's way of defining you based on, okay, well, if you're born with supposedly being female, okay, then you are supposed to do X, Y, Z. And X, Y, Z looks different in different cultures, okay? So what can be perceived as X, Y, Z, you know, here is definitely not X, Y, Z, you know, in another country. And so I think people are often labeled as being male or female very simply in their gender roles, but gender is very complex. Some people, you know, feel like they are more than one gender or multiple genders or not really definable genders, and that's even true in the Latino culture. So it's just not very visible because maybe people don't get to have those deep conversations, or it doesn't really come out because there's a lot of discrimination in that sense. So,
or if it is portrayed, it's presented as kind of like an exotic issue.
Yes, yes, and in, I would say, generally speaking, in Latino culture overall, in the traditional culture, people are not comfortable talking about their sexuality, and that space hasn't been created like it was here in the feminist movement, which is a great thing. But that is just not part of the way of, you know, you talk coming out about your sexuality. You don't really talk about sexuality in general. And again, this is different in the cities and in the class issues and all that, but there's a lot of negotiation based on who you are and where you come from, and so a lot of that is hidden, but it's definitely there. I mean, I've had Latinas of every gender variation, sexual orientation in the program, and some people would never know. You know, everyone is represented though.
I think part of the barrier that we can kind of talk about in terms of the gender studies piece is, you know, if there is, I think the Carawina word, that's basically the same language group that we get the word taboo. And it's related to taboo. It's called moquita. So a moquita is something that everybody knows and nobody talks about.
Yes, yes.
Right? And if you do talk about it, it could have deadly consequences. So part of the barrier is, I mean, if we look at this historically, you know, the Spanish using their war dogs on native two-spirited people, right? Who had a sacred and necessary and practical place in their culture, and then so Native people knew, oh well, we don't talk about our, you know, our two spirits, even if we have like 5 different words for them. Yes. We don't talk about them with these white folks.
Exactly, and just to clarify, I know what that is, but just it's the two-spirit is someone who is thought to embody both a balance of the feminine and masculine aspects as defined however it was then.
And transcendent of both.
And transcendent of both, exactly. Which is very common, and a lot of spiritual leaders are viewed in that way because they're beyond the scope of borders, so to speak. You know.
So then the negative gets used, right? So then you get called names, and then the names, of course, are derogatory, right? And then there becomes a period of shame. Then you reclaim it and take on that name, you know, right? But then we never necessarily get to, you know, another stage where we talk about, oh, what about the names that were respectful and basically talking about power? We don't get to that stage, especially for people of color, because living in a society that has skin privilege, white skin privilege, it gets defined by white gays and lesbians.
Yes, and which is a different culture, you know, that has its own culture.
Right.
And it's, you know, it has to do with urban culture as well, I think, because I think a lot of even American gay and lesbian and transgender, et cetera, people living in the Midwest may not have the same type of culture because, again, it's not as supported. And so it has to do with, you know, urban and class privilege as well, being able to come out in that way.
And or whether you can come out and how you get you get to come out.
And how you get to live your life. And I know of several Latina lesbians in this community who I respect a lot and who are incredible fighters for human rights. And I know that they struggle in both communities. And, you know, my support goes out to them. They know who they are. And they've done...
We've had at least one on the show.
I'm sure. These are beautiful people who have touched a lot of women's and men's lives and who I wish to see integrated in both communities or accepted into both communities, because they're often alienated in both the lesbian community that's predominantly white and urban, as well as in the immigrant, predominantly immigrant in this Lane County area, because we're still largely, the Latinos in this area are still largely an immigrant and first generation population.
Right.
And that looks very different than, say, somewhere in Southern California when, you know, California was Mexico and still is, you know, and people have been there, you know, we're always there and feel that privilege and feel that pride and have their roots and have, you know, more of a history there. So there are a lot of people here, and it's very complicated. And what I like about Lane and the Women's Center is that we're very supportive of everyone. We try to meet people where they're at, and you know, I think that overall we do a good job with that.
So, how would you counsel somebody in that situation that has a dream or a goal to be able to achieve that dream or goal? I mean, my elders basically talked about what I call, I express it algebraically, 2x plus y. So x is white privilege, right? And so you have to know twice as much of white privilege and be twice as good as what the average recipient of white privilege is to be considered equal, and plus, so 2x plus y and y. You need to do that. And so part of that is not only being excellent, but also overcoming the barriers that other people have of you.
Yes. Part of what I like to teach is about, you know, putting up boundaries and how to have respectful boundaries, how to respect yourself, validate yourself in that process, have compassion with yourself and where you're at. Okay, this is who I am, X, Y, Z, and you know, you can have your list of isms of how you're treated, as well as how you define yourself outside of that, your own history, which we have an identity outside of the oppression. And so, but realizing both and integrating that and defining that, and then putting up a very safe boundary around that, defining what does that boundary look like, surrounding yourself with a lot of loving friends. In the class, I tried very deeply to build a network of women, and I talk about all the isms initially, and I say we do not discriminate in Lane Community College based on these things. This is what it means. We are going to respect each other in this classroom. You may have a Latina here who is poor, who is a lesbian, who is, you know, or wealthy, and who is, you know, been beaten up, or, you know, whatever the different situations may be. So I try to get the class to start really hearing their stories through compassionate lenses and helping them to build the friendships across. So then the women are building their own personal boundaries, they're defining their stories, redefining their stories in a very empowering way. They are the only ones who can do that throughout the class. I don't give advice, and other people don't do it as well. It's sort of forbidden in the classroom, just so that we can really immerse ourselves in the story. And then women take that out, and I often suggest a counselor. So different counselors that are in the community, so that women can have the network of friendship, the practical student advising advice after they are done with the coursework, as well as then a counselor and a network of women to go out into the community with. And if they need like different student groups, then I suggest some student groups and how to give them ideas that they can be leaders in those student groups and start making changes, and they start to see themselves in that way. You know, you really start to see yourself in the way that your teachers and your peers see you. And so if I put a high standard, which I do, I always do, I'm like, your PhD material, if you want it. You don't have to be, but if you want it, it's there. It's there for you. You could just reach out and get it.
Right.
And we're just going to figure out how to get
and understand
there.
That there are barriers on the way that you have to reach through.
And we have to just figure out how to knock those barriers out as they come up, and don't give up in the process, and keep seeking support. You keep seeking support. When one door closes, you just go after the next one. And you come back around and around and around, and you don't stop calling. So I teach them to keep calling. I teach them to go to different places. I take them on a tour. We eat together here at Lane. We have a little ritual around getting to know the buildings in a way that's comfortable for them. And when we do that, by the end of the term, the women feel like this is their place, by and large. I mean, and if they need it again, I do it with them again, individually. So it's a very, they need a lot of support, but they just have to hear the message that they're, you know, and the validation that they're worthy. And some people already come feeling like they're worthy, and that's fantastic. I mean, I love that. And they just need the practical advice around where to go or how to fill out an application. So it depends on the person, but that's how I would advise someone, if especially they're at that level where they're just, you know, starting to really reconstruct themselves because a lot of things have happened. Then I give them a lot of support, and we give them a lot of support so that they feel like that's a tangible goal, and that we do baby steps. Oh, you did this. That's fantastic. You just passed ESL1. Now you pass ESL2. It's a year later. Look, you didn't think you could do this. Oh, well, you got stuck at 5. Let's find a tutor. So, you know, it's very step by step, but it's always holding that long-term vision in mind, and honestly believing that they're capable of it. And people know if you're real with them or not, you know.
They do. They find that out quickly. Okay, so one of the things I notice, and I wonder if you've considered doing this, there are a lot of stories. There a book?
I didn't tell you this, but I started writing a book a couple years ago on a self-empowerment healing manual.
Well, I'm just saying, because, you know.
And I'd like to start writing
Cara D. and Judy C.
Yes, and Cara DeMarco is amazing. She's written several books, and I think she's in process around her third one. And I started one a couple years ago because I did 2 rounds of my own women's empowerment groups in the community, and I'm probably going to start up another one this summer, so it'll be the third year I do one. And out of that grew an inspiration of, I really want to teach people what I learned on my master's degree in a condensed and really accessible form. A bunch of scholars write about how we need to make things more accessible, but they're still writing and arguing with other scholars, which is not accessible.
Right.
And I understand that there's a need for
the arguments are rather rarefied, you know, they're not on the ground.
And so I know how to make things on the ground because I am from the ground. I am from the roots. I am of the people who didn't understand the system, and I know how to translate my master's degree into something that people can get through fun exercises, through different, you know, tangible ways and simple ways. It doesn't have to be complex. So, and then I also thought of writing a book on women's stories, and I like to do film on it at some day, because I feel like their stories is just, people need to hear them. People need to feel the complexity of their lives, and how beautiful and deep they are, and what dreams they have, and how much effort is put in. I really want people to hear those stories. I think things would change if they heard the stories. Other people heard the stories. So
the image that I just saw was that, you know, if you get browbeaten, all you got see the stars of the pain swimming around, and you don't see the ground, and you don't see the flowers on the ground, and you don't see, you know, the garden that you planted, because you've been, oh, well, that's only, you don't have acreage, you just have a little flower pot.
Yeah.
But it's something that's rare. You don't get that. It's a trillium, you know, growing in a flower pot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's like to appreciate that flower that's bursting from after the freaking storms that have been so awful. What a miracle. What a miracle to have that flower come up. That's what, throughout the course, I want the women, and I think that they end up really appreciating their struggle, and really appreciating that some things are still going to be a struggle, but that they don't have to struggle in other ways if they just do a few, you know, things around boundaries and some things are going to be a struggle, and just to kind of expect them, and to how to deal with them when they come up, and how to get the support so when they come up they're not isolated, because it's really the isolation that kills people. It's not the group unity. I mean, you can do a lot in a group, even if it's a small group of friends, even if it's a small group of teachers that help you. In college, I almost dropped out several times. If it hadn't been for several teachers that really cared. I mean, they were like, you can do this. And I never saw myself as a teacher. I was the one in the back, hiding in the back row, like maybe asking a question if no one was looking, maybe waiting till the end of the class and shaking while I was doing it, literally almost having a panic attack just to ask a question because of my life. And a lot of these women are the same way, and they have a fear around public speaking. And it's just, you know, it's just learning to appreciate those stories and learning to really value the experience and the wisdom that they already bring to the classroom, and just sharing that with one another, and then watching other people appreciate it. That is really transformative for them. And for me, I'm so honored to work with these women and hear their lives and share their tears. It's just, I couldn't be in a more, in a bigger seat of honor.
We've been honored to have you. I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
If you like what you've seen, send us an email at liveclass@lanecc.edu. Tell us what you liked about this program and any other programs that you've seen. Tell a friend about this show. Put DiversiTV in the subject line. And suggest future shows. We have another 9 shows to go in this season. Not all booked yet. And we'll keep you posted. Until then, go well, stay well. This has been DiversiTV.